And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing this front edging slowly eastward, but it's not going to make too much more progress to the east. So it'll stay rainy for Kodiak Island, snow from the Alaska Peninsula, with much lighter winds here west of the front here all the way up to the Arctic coast. Winds slowly coming down here south central Alaska and also along the Alaska Range late tonight with dry conditions southeast coast, north Gulf Coast, right on up to the eastern Arctic coast. And for tomorrow, that front now turns into a warm front, starts edging its way back to the west a little bit. Snow from the Brooks Range southward to the Alaska Peninsula. Rain ending, but staying cloudy here for Kodiak Island. Next system down here to the south pulls northward, gale force winds and rain. Kodiak Island and snow continues along the remnants of that trough here over the western interior. Dry in the east, snow showers out to the west, and sunshine for the Panhandle with light winds. For the coastal water forecast for the southeast coast, central and south coast here, looking at east winds at 20 knots, and the north coast about the same, east winds 15 to 20 knots, Lynn Canal, north winds 20 knots. Small craft advisories though for Stevens Passage for those northeast winds at 25 knots, and north winds 15 knots for Clarence Strait. And for the day on Thursday, still easterly winds here all along the coast, 15 knots on the north coast, central and south coast 20 knots with possible gale force gusts here along Prince of Wales Island, otherwise Clarence Strait north at 20, north 25 for Stevens Passage, and north 20 knots for Lynn Canal. Prince William Sound, northeast winds 15 knots for Wednesday, and for the eastern North Gulf Coast, east winds 25 knots, northeast at 30 knots for the western North Gulf Coast, and small craft advisories for Cook Inlet, northeast winds 25 to 30 knots, gale warnings, Kamishak Bay, east winds at 40 knots, and gales also for the Barren Islands for east winds at 45 knots. And then for Thursday, storm warnings for the Barren Islands now, east winds 50 knots, seas 21 feet, 45 knot easterlies for Kamishak Bay with seas up to 16 feet, and northeast winds 25 to 30 knots for Cook Inlet. Prince William Sound, east winds at 20 knots, eastern North Gulf Coast, east winds at 30 knots, and 35 knot northeast winds for the western North Gulf Coast. Kodiak Island, east winds 30 to 35 knots for Wednesday, north at 20 for Bristol Bay. Alaska Peninsula, north winds 30 to 40 knots. And for Thursday, Bristol Bay, east winds 30 knots. And the Alaska Peninsula here, north to northeast winds anywhere from 15 to 30 knots. Kodiak Island, east winds 40 knots. And for Unalaska Island, gale warnings tomorrow, north winds at 35 knots. Otherwise, variable winds 10 to 10 knots for the central Aleutians, and south winds 30 knots for the western Aleutians. And then for Thursday, out west there, west of Adak, anywhere from south to southeast, 25 to 30 knots around Amchitka Island, from Kiska to Shemya, west winds at 20 to 25 knots. Adak and Atka, southeast at 20 knots, and then north to northwest winds 20 to 35 knots for the eastern Aleutians. And for the southwest coast here, south of Nunivak Island, got north winds at 30 knots for the day tomorrow. Northwest at 10, pretty light for the Yukon Delta coast. Light variable winds, St. Matthew Island at 10 knots, Pribilofs north at 15, southwest winds 15 knots, Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island. And then for Thursday, St. Lawrence Island, Norton Sound, north winds at about 20 knots. Brisk wind advisories here for the southwest coast, north at 25 knots. North winds 25, 7-foot seas for the Pribilofs. Northeast winds 20 knots for St. Matthew Island. And for the Chukchi Sea, tomorrow, south winds 20 to 25 knots. Western Arctic coast, gale warnings. Southwest winds 40 knots. Brisk wind advisories for the central coast. Southwest at 30 knots, and west to southwest winds at 20 to 25 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast. Then on Thursday, these winds here on the eastern Arctic coast turn northeast, come down to about 10 knots, southwest 20 for the central coast, west-southwest winds 15 knots for the western Arctic coast, and the Chukchi Sea, looking at northerly winds at 20 knots.